Hi there, my name is Katelin Hansen. I'm with By Their Strength, and you are joining us for MennoNerds webcast. We are here this evening with Deborah Ferber. We're glad to have you. We're going to be talking about disability theology. I'm looking forward to having a great conversation with you, Deborah. To us from Windsor, Ontario, and we're glad to have her. She graduated with her MDiv in pastoral ministry in 2015 and has served internationally in Scotland and where she lives in Canada, helping folks with developmental disabilities for many years now. Has been a field associate with the Disability Network, worked with a variety of churches on this important. So glad to have you this evening.
Thank you, Katelin.
I'm hoping maybe we could start off just by talking about what we mean by disability theology and what that means.
Sure, definitely. So I personally describe disability as a limitation of some sort that is either physical, emotional, or developmental. And it's important to note that disabilities can be either visible or invisible. So an obvious example of a visible disability would be someone who uses a wheelchair or an other assistive device. An example of an invisible disability would be, for example, something that we can't see right away. So that could be anything from fibromyalgia to mental illness, which would not be apparent at first glance until you got to know the person and maybe they would disclose it to you that they have a certain issue. When we talk about disability theology in particular, I think it's referring to our ministry practices, how the church engages or chooses not to engage with people who have a disability, and how our construct of God is influenced or impacted by the ways that we typically view our society through able-bodied lenses.
And so where is the intersection of our theology and particularly being mindful of these issues in the church? What does the Bible have to say about these issues?
Interesting, because for many of us who grew up in the church, I think we had a certain image of Jesus as sort of a strong type of man who basically was perfect, we could say. We don't really think about Jesus in disabled terms, and in some settings that might even be considered sacrilegious or not appropriate to bring out that there is such a thing as a disabled God, if you will. However, when we read the Bible itself, we do see that there are plenty of examples. You know, for example, in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, it talks about the suffering servant, and it describes Jesus as being bruised and battered and having a disfigured form. We know definitely at least once in his life, which was during the crucifixion, that Jesus was physically disfigured because of beatings. So I think that historically, although we have always portrayed Jesus as a strong character, that there is ample biblical evidence that it wasn't always necessarily that way.
Absolutely. And I've wondered how much our sort of habits of theology or our own biased eyes as we read scripture might even facilitate or perpetuate ableism in our church. And yeah, I think about lifting up Jesus as a healer, which often happens, but I wonder how much, to what extent that promotes the idea of needing to be fixed, and how in what ways have you had a chance to wrestle with some of that we see in our church?
Yeah, that's definitely a really good question. I think one of the commentaries I read, the name is escaping me at the moment, unfortunately, but it's basically this idea of that although Jesus did heal many people, and we know through the Bible that he did heal those who were lame, the blind, the lepers, but we also know that Jesus did not heal every single person in those categories. Now, we don't know exactly why, but he chose one person over the other. But I think for me, the one example from the Bible that kind of shows that disability is not something that necessarily needs to be fixed per se is in the example of the man who was born blind. When at that time period, a physical disability was considered a result of sin, and so the people coming to Jesus said, "Who sinned? Was it this man or his parents?" And Jesus said, "Actually, no one sinned, but it's so that you can experience God's grace in a greater way." And I've heard that in churches as well, even in my ministry working with people who have developmental disabilities, that a lot of parents may have a sense of shame or blame themselves. There's sometimes guilt attached to having a child with a disability for whatever reason, but it's not because the child themselves is any less valued by God and by the church. It's actually a result because they can bring something that the rest of us would miss because we don't have that different way of seeing the world.
Absolutely. Talk about that a little bit, about that last point, because I think we worship a God of abundance, a God of assets, and every person is an asset. So yeah, I'd love for you to expound on that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think that there's definitely so many different ways that people with disability can enhance our worship style, our sense of being together. So for me, I know when I started L'Arche, so L'Arche is the organization that I've been working with for the past 3 years, which is an intentional community for adults with developmental disabilities. When I first started working with them, we have chapels once a week, and I'm accepting communion during one of the services, and it was given to me by someone who has cerebral palsy, and they still said the same words, the body of Christ broken for you, and thinking about how much more meaningful that is coming from someone who society would deem as broken. The body of Christ, it includes everyone, so I think even though a lot of churches talk the talk, a lot of churches will say, oh yes, we include everyone, everyone's welcome here, but the way that it's played out is not always the case. I mean, definitely there are churches that are doing a good job, but it's not necessarily that way in every single church. So having someone in an upfront position who is visibly different than us, I think just really reminds us that there's a place for everyone to be included.
Yeah, absolutely. That visibility is so important when it comes to just a wide range of justice issues in our churches, and that invisibility that you speak of can even be more so when it comes to issues of disability. Issues of race and gender are often more visible, but justice issues around ability sometimes really aren't. I'm wondering if you can talk about how we can be more intentional around that.
Yeah, for sure. So I actually wrote a blog post. Last summer, I attended a disability theology conference in Belfast in the UK, in Ireland. And the title of my article was actually, "Where's the justice in that?" including people with disabilities into the church. And it's sort of, once again, that idea of exclusion versus inclusion. So we had a guest speaker named Dr. Jeff McNair. He's actually a very well-known, prominent figure in the disability theology setting, and he's one of the pioneers for disability ministry because it's actually quite a recent thing to start including people with disabilities into the life of the church. And he said that all we need to do is really go to church on any given Sunday morning and you look around and you see how many people have a disability. Now, again, this is a bit of a challenge because, like I mentioned, there are invisible disabilities and not everyone will come out and self-disclose as having a disability, even if they truly did. But I know for me at that time, I was living in Scotland and I went to a fairly large church. I think it probably had about 500 or 600 people. We had 3 services. And I was sitting, after that conference, I intentionally decided to sit on the balcony so that I could look down and to have a better view of the church. And I noticed that this church was doing a lot of things right, that there were lots of men and women, that there were people of different ages, that there were many different nationalities there. But as far as I could tell, there was not a single person with a physical disability, at least that was recognizable. And I started asking myself why. And another question that we have to ask ourselves is our church silent? Because when you think about people with developmental disabilities, and I say this from experience, many of them are not silent. You know, someone who has, for example, autism, they will what they call STEM. So that means that they'll hum or make other kinds of loud noises. And a lot of churches, they really discourage that. They just want the church to be quiet, and basically you sit there and you listen to whoever's preaching and you don't have any disruptions. But people with disabilities, they will disrupt services. They will ask questions in the middle of a sermon. I've been in a few churches where someone with Down syndrome thought the sermon was going on too long, and they actually stood up and said, the sermon is getting too long and I'm bored. So they don't really filter out this kind of things that the rest of us do. So if you go to a church and you notice, first of all, that there's no one with a disability there, and second of all, that it's a very quiet service without interruptions, then we have to ask ourselves why. Because the church might say, well, we will include everyone, but even if they are going to include everyone, there's still some kind of barrier why people with disabilities feel that they can't attend that particular church.
Yeah, there's a term that we like to use at Church for All People here in Columbus, Ohio, that is holy chaos.
There you go.
Our worship service can turn into. We experience a lot of behavioral health in our congregation just by the nature of who we are. And that means there's a lot of disruption during the service, people standing up and sitting down and making noise or having conversation or any number of things that are not reminiscent of, perhaps a high, holy, silent setting, meditative and, contemplative. We call that holy chaos.
There you go. Perfect.
We've had to learn that is, in many ways, an act of worship. And then also figure out how we honor the many ways of worshiping God. Because we do have people in our congregation that miss that meditative type setting, that worship quiet setting, and how do we honor their ways of worshiping and provide them some quiet space, and maybe it's in a different setting, maybe it's not during the worship set, so that we can be welcoming to everyone. And it's always a balancing act, I think. But we're always, grateful for the opportunity to have worship in that. But I would challenge folks if they're not careful to get out of their own comfort zone with that. I wonder if you could speak to some of the ways that churches can be more intentional about being welcoming and inclusive.
Yeah, sure. It's really interesting because I'm actually working with 2 churches at the moment, sort of on pilot projects to start getting the ball rolling. After a number of years in the group home setting, I decided that's more my calling, to bring it to the churches themselves. I think a really good way to start would just be to become aware of the needs in your own community and in your own congregation. Because if you aren't aware of the needs that are happening right in front of you, you won't know how to take that further. So some resources I have suggest even creating a kind of confidential questionnaire that anyone can answer. What would they like to see? If there are particular people in your church that have a disability who would be open to a conversation, you could also ask them specifically what they would like and how to make church more meaningful and relevant to them. I think right now, to make it kind of seasonally appropriate, so now is the time of Christmas, and there's actually a lot of things to consider with Christmas that maybe we don't necessarily think about unless we're consciously trying to think about disability. But one example is the use of candles. Because for some people, for example, if they have visual impairments or some people with disabilities, they might actually feel a little bit anxious or agitated because of the candles, and that actually detracts from exactly what you want to do, because the whole point of the candles is to try to provide a peaceful atmosphere. But if you are going to use candles, I would say try to not use scented ones, try to use unscented ones, because a lot of people with different types of sensory issues, the scents themselves can create a bit of panic and alarm. Also being sensitive about the topics that surround Christmas. So Christmas traditionally has been a time of family and community, and everyone's happy and joyful, but generally speaking, a very happy time. But for someone maybe who is experiencing the loss of a spouse for the first time, or going through a season of depression, this could actually be a very alienating experience for them. A lot of people with mental illness feel that there's no one that they can talk to during this time because they don't want to ruin someone's Christmas, or that the pastor might be too busy with his or her congregation. They won't have time to sit down and have a conversation. So it's just kind of being aware of those things, and not necessarily that we have to make that the focus of our Christmas service, but trying to be aware of the resources out there that we need to try to make this an inclusive Christmas for everyone possible.
I've also, around the Christmas season, wondered about the appropriateness of certain songs that have lyrics about like the blind, the deaf ear, and
That's true.
behind them is, again, Jesus the healer. But I've wondered if those would be appropriate songs for everyone.
Yeah, that's something I've wondered myself as well. I can tell you that in my own church, it's quite a small church that I'm attending at the moment, but we have a few people who are blind, and we have sung those songs. As far as I can tell, it did not make them upset or angry. I actually have talked to a few people individually to get some more ideas, but I could see how, like you said, that can add into the sense of entitlement or the sense of ableism. Offhand, I don't really know of any specifically that I would recommend to sing, but it is something, yeah, definitely to consider.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to call upon our artists and musicians to create some Christmas and year-long hymns that are affirming and inclusive. However, what that might look like, both for our musicians and our visual artists that decorate our sanctuaries, what that might look like to challenge our churches in that way.
Definitely.
I wonder also if the church has particular opportunity around advocacy as people of peace, as people of justice. What might the role of the church be when it comes to advocating around these issues?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, first of all, just being aware that there shouldn't be any sense of shame or disillusionment, kind of not making a big deal of it, because in my own experience, I've seen that there are kind of two negative ways that people in general, not just churches, but in general, our society kind of victimizes people with disabilities. So one is to outright, abuse the person, which obviously is not acceptable in any sense, but they might critique the person or criticize or make fun of or tease. But the other way is actually sort of making the person the hero. So every single thing that they do, even if it's something that, if an able-bodied person were to do it, no one would think twice, but because of someone who has an impairment, right away, oh, let's make a YouTube video about it and share it all over the internet that this person was walking a dog, or like, how cool is that, So I think sort of just normalizing the experience. Like there's this catchphrase that we use a lot, like disable the label. So it's about seeing the person rather than the disability, that the disability is a part of who the person is, but it's not the entire part of who the person is, that they still have many gifts and strengths, and they're still able to do majority of things that the rest of us are doing. So yeah, I think it's just giving people a voice. One thing that I've become really passionate about over the past 4 years is just seeing people with disabilities as an unreached people group within our own community, which sounds strange when you say it at first, because usually when we think of unreached people group, we think of being missionaries in maybe countries where their gospel is not readily proclaimed or there aren't already a lot of Christians. But this came to me because in my very first year of disability advocacy, I learned the statistic that in the US, and I'm sure it's pretty similar in Canada, if not worse, is that in the US, only 6% of deaf Christians attend a church. And it's not because the other 94% don't want to attend a church or that they're not Christian or they're not interested. It's because most churches cannot hire an interpreter. Having an interpreter in your congregation is a very expensive process, and you have to be properly trained for it. And going to church itself is a very oral culture. You know, we sing hymns, we hear a sermon being preached, we share our joys and concerns orally. So if you are hearing impaired, there is essentially no reason to go to a church. You won't get much out of it. And I was actually reading an article by a man who is deaf himself, and he was born deaf, and he was recounting his experience. He no longer goes to church, but he was recounting his experience as a young boy when his grandma took him to church. And all he thought in his mind is that the point of church was to pay the pastor for giving a sermon, because as soon as the sermon was over, they passed around the offering plates, they brought it up to the front, and the pastor was there, had a huge smile on his face. So this boy, his entire childhood, grew up thinking that's the only reason to go there, that there wasn't anything else. He didn't understand anything that was being shared. So for me, I think that would be a really good thing for churches to think about. I know it is an expense, but if there are people in the church who would be willing to learn even a little bit of sign language, I think that could go a long way to help include other people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it occurs to me, I know we have someone that's very skilled in ASL in our congregation, someone that is hearing, and what would it look like to invite her into creating intentional ministry in that area. We have invited her up to interpret songs on a fairly regular basis, but haven't taken that next step to build a ministry, an intentional ministry. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm hoping you might be willing to share where your heart for this work comes from, and then maybe that to talk about your work with the L'Arche movement.
Sure. So actually, to be honest, my journey into disability ministry, it almost came accidentally in a way. So I know a lot of times being a Mennonite, calling is very important to us, and we always talk about, you know, what's your calling and who else in the community has affirmed you in this calling. But although I don't negate that, although I think that there definitely are people who go into pastoral or teaching or counseling with that specific goal in mind, with a specific calling, I also believe that it's possible that over time you can develop and grow into a calling. So what actually happened, how I ended up in L'Arche, is I graduated from Tyndale with my Bachelor's of Religious Education in 2012. I was 21 years old, and I decided I wanted to be a pastor. That was always a goal of mine, or what I thought at that time was a calling of mine. And so I decided that, logically speaking, the next step would be to go to seminary, to do an MDiv, and that would make churches more interested in hiring me. But I think at that time, speaking for myself, I don't think I was quite ready to go to seminary. I think I was very young and probably still needed to mature a little bit. So I went to seminary, and it actually didn't work out for me at first. So when I realized it wasn't working out for me, and I decided, what am I going to do to kind of have a gap year, to spend some time thinking about different things. And what I did is, L'Arche was always in the back of my mind, because in my undergrad, we had a speaker, Sister Suma Steller, who is instrumental in the L'Arche community in Canada. She's actually one of the founding members, and she's been with L'Arche over 50 years. So she actually came to Tyndale, where I was a student, and she talked about L'Arche, and I just remember seeing sort of her passion and hearing the story, first-hand accounts that she's had over the 50 years. And what I was really impressed by her is that I was a TA for a first-year class, so there were a bunch of like 17, 18, 19-year-olds who really didn't want to be there. And she, people were not listening to her. People were not like paying any attention to her. And instead of getting angry about it, even though she was our guest speaker, she said, you know, I should be angry that you're not paying any attention to me, but I'm just going to assume that you're a wounded person. And just like this kind of compassion and this sense of love. And I was like, wow. And I talked to her after the fact, and she's like, yeah, I learned all this through L'Arche. And since that day, I decided in the back of my mind, L'Arche was something I wanted to pursue. So when the opportunity came up that that I knew I wasn't going to continue with my studies, I decided to try and kind of apply to L'Arche on the whim. I actually had no idea what I was getting myself into. And at that particular point, I can't say that I had like a huge passion for disability. It was more like, oh, that's something I've always wanted to do. That sounds interesting and cool, like for a gap year idea. So I went ahead and did it. But once L'Arche accepted me, so I applied in December. I went to an interview which went like totally horribly, and I thought that there's no possible way they're going to hire me because I made a complete fool of myself. Like every single thing they tell you not to do in an interview, I did. And they ended up saying like the next day that you're hired, and I was so shocked. So since that day that they hired me, I still had 1 semester left. At that time I was going to AMBS, Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, and I decided that I would take every opportunity for a class to make it somehow related to disability ministry. So that was really great because AMBS is a really good organization, really good institution for that, to allow you to kind of tailor your studies to whatever you're interested in. So for example, I took a worship leading class, and then I intentionally chose, how can I worship lead to a congregation if it was like a disability inclusion Sunday? For my theology classes, I would say, I'm going to write an article about disability theology. So every single class. And when I was doing that, I realized that I had this passion, that it just was so much more interesting to me when I had that in the back of my mind. And then went to 1 year. I had my ups and downs like most L'Arche assistants do in their first year, because it's something just totally radical to live in an intentional community with people with disabilities 24/7. That's just so different than anything I would have imagined in my life. And then after a year, I decided that I would stay on another year, and then 2 years became 3 years. And now when people talk to me, I say that I can't imagine my life any other way, that at this stage, because of this 3 years in L'Arche, I cannot imagine my life without having people with disabilities around me, not so much as a caregiver or, oh, I have to pity that person, I have to do something for them, but they're actually my friends. You know, they're actually people I spend time with, that even when I'm not so-called working, I still invite them to my birthday party, I still invite them to my graduation party, because they're just such a part of who I am now.
So how have those relationships been a journey of accompaniment between each of you, relationships of mutuality as you've grown, and presumably those you're in relationship have also grown? How have you seen both parties be affected?
Yeah, I think one of the best examples that I can give is, it actually happened in my first year. My house, in L'Arche, we have our own sort of terminology. So it's like just a completely different way of thinking. So for example, instead of saying that someone's going through a hard time, you would say that person's living a lot. So in my first year, my house was living a lot because I was there in August. Yeah, so I was there in August, and then 1 month after that, one of our core members, so one of our people with disabilities, passed away. And then my supervisor, my house leader, he got really sick and he had to take a leave of absence. And then another coworker got really sick as well and had to take some time of absence. So all of these things were like very tumultuous and really intense. And looking back, the only reason I can think that I stayed in L'Arche even after all this in my first month was because of the people with disabilities around me. And I remember just one of the traditions we have in L'Arche is to pray the Lord's Prayer every night. And we pray it together as a house around the table. And one day I was sharing with the core members about how I was feeling, that, you know, things were not going so well because of all these issues that were surrounding me. We were praying the Lord's Prayer, and one of my core members who has Down syndrome came up to me, and he was kind of like rubbing my back. And then he gave me a hug, and he's like, everything's going to be okay. And then it was at that moment that I realized that the people with disabilities are actually offering me so much, because when someone has a disability, it's impossible to put up a front. You know, a lot of us, we put up actually, you know, someone asks you, how are you doing? And you say, oh, I'm fine, even if you're not fine. But that's how our society teaches us to be, that you don't, you know, burden your soul to someone else. That's just not done. But with people with disabilities, they can see through everything. So if you're not being totally honest with them, they'll call you on it. So that's where you see this authenticity of relationships, because you just get to be yourself and they just accept you as who you are. Like, they're not concerned about your degrees. They're not concerned about what you've done with your life. They could care less if you've published a book or you're a famous actor. Like, to them, they just want to be your friends, and that's the bottom line. They really don't care about anything else.
Is that sort of authenticity and transparency challenging at times?
It can be, definitely. It depends on, I think, yeah, it really depends on the person. Like, if you're a more private person, I could see that that could be more challenging for you. But I think with disability theology and disability ministry, even if you're there for years and years and years, you never truly get it. Like, you can work towards getting it more and more, but like, by no means am I perfect at this either. Because I think it's still easy at times to fall into the temptation of being the caregiver or doing things for the person. It's easy for even those of us who have been in the field, it's easy for us to still slip into that ableism mentality. So it's always like reminding ourselves that we need to include these people with disabilities. Actually, like the conference I mentioned before in Belfast, one of the ladies who spoke at it, she has a daughter who has Down syndrome. And she was saying about how one day she was at the store, and now her daughter's about 30, so she's been in the disability field for 30 years as a result of her daughter. But she was at the store, and there was this young man who needed help, and he had a visible disability. And she decided, I don't have time to help him because I'm in a rush and I have to pay my groceries and I have to go back home to my daughter. And she had all these things processing through her mind. So she didn't take the time to help this person with a visible disability. And when she shared at the conference, she was actually so upset that she didn't take that time. And she was even crying. So that shows that, yeah, none of us are immune. That is something we have to keep working at. And even when we think that we've got it, we have to keep trying harder and harder at it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that can be a challenge for our churches when, you know, they're sometimes running a million miles an hour and stretched in, and they're trying to, you know, put heads in the, but it's so,
yeah,
step back and ask ourselves, you know, what is at the heart of what we're trying to do, and that's to be the body of Christ and to be that loving family, that sanctuary for one another, and to not get, you know, miss the forest for the trees of what we're called to do.
That's true.
Maybe you can also tell us a bit about the Anabaptist Disability Network and what that's all about.
Yeah, sure. So this organization that's now called ADN, Anabaptist Disability Network, they're based out of Elkhart. So that's actually really convenient because their office is part of the MCUSA building, which makes them in very close proximity to AMBS. And that's actually how I first got connected with them, when I decided that I wanted to get into disability ministry, and I was still a student there. And I talked to one of my professors, and she said, oh, you should talk to Christine Guth, who was the program director at the time. Now it's Denise Reeser. But basically what we do is that we are creating resources for people and congregations who want to become more inclusive. So we have a few books out that are available. We also do guest speaking arrangements. So if someone wants a certain, we call them field associates, we're volunteers. So if someone, say for example, they live in Kentucky and they would like our field associates to talk at their church about disability theology, they can get in touch with ADNET, and then ADNET would see if there's a field associate who can partner up with that church. They're also really good for, if you already have ideas, you can process it to them, and they usually have resources. We have a blog. We also do a lot of writing just internally with our blogs. And we try, sometimes we also publish like outside, like individual field associates will also publish to outside magazines or different things like that.
I'm wondering if we could talk for a moment around issues of intersectionality and how ableism might intersect with things like classism or racism, or other sorts of injustices that might intersect with these issues.
Yeah, that's definitely a good point. I definitely can speak to a few of those areas. For classism, or economic injustice, as we could say, one of the big areas is surrounding people with disabilities not being employed. At least in Canada, a lot of people with disabilities are sort of, on unemployment insurance or Ontario disability support programs. And it's not always because they have to be. Like, definitely there are disabilities which you would have to be long-term disability insurance for that. But actually, a lot of people are willing and able to work, but a lot of employers don't hire people with disabilities for whatever reason, which is actually really unfortunate, because when you do your research, you realize that people with disabilities actually make star employees. So for example, people with Down syndrome, they've done studies on this, where hiring someone with Down syndrome, the person with Down syndrome is usually a very good worker. And I'm just using Down syndrome as an example. It could be any disability, but they're usually a really hard worker. They're very proud of their work, so they want to do a good job. And they're not like the complaining type usually, whereas an able-bodied person, they might complain. Say, for example, working at McDonald's, they might say, oh, I have a master's degree, so why am I flipping burgers? That's below me. That's beneath me. I shouldn't have to do this. Whereas someone with a disability is usually really excited for that, because they just want that sense of being included and doing a good job. And they've done studies showing that people with disabilities rarely call in sick for work, or their calling in sick for work is way below average to any other employee. And I know when I worked at L'Arche, we had day programs for our core members, and they would actually go out to these day programs and they would come home with a check. And they just felt like such a sense of accomplishment. They were so proud of this check that they got, even though it usually is not that much money. But just, so I think that's one way that we kind of foster it, that we think, oh, this person, they can't do it. We give them credit for doing less than they actually can, you know?
Mhm.
So that's one way for classism. For racism, they've actually done studies as well showing, I think this was a UK study, because I read about it in the UK. So in the UK, we have a magazine called The Big Issue, which is actually a homeless magazine to raise awareness and to raise funds for homeless ministries. But they've done studies showing that about 60% of people in prison right now have a developmental disability, and of some sort, varying degrees of disability, but a disability nonetheless. And that even more so, a majority of them are people of color. So we see that that police are not really thinking like as the person as a whole. It's more just like an idea. I'm not trying to like paint all police as bad or something, but we do see that that's a definite problem, at least in the UK, that this is a recurrent problem. And then I think lastly, with gender issues like LGBTQ kind of awareness, at least speaking from the disability idea, from what I know from my own studies and my own experience, is that people with disabilities are often taught sort of to be asexual. I think we're starting to get away from that now in our society and in our day and age, but I know for me, like working with people with disabilities, they've been taught their whole life that they shouldn't feel like any sense of attraction. And in Canada, in like the 40s and 50s, people were actually sterilized. So even if they had romantic intentions, that there was no possible way to procreate. And I think that also brings in all other issues, because if we don't talk about sexuality in general, we can't bring in like the different types of sexual orientations, right? But thankfully, we are getting better at that now, and they are trying to improve it, but there's still a lot more they could do. There's still a long way to go.
Those are really great points, important things to be aware of, and often in conversations around injustice, there is, as you've mentioned, an invisibility to issues of ability, and including those in it. I know, at least in the United States, the school to prison pipeline gets lifted up a lot when it comes to racial justice, but it's a very serious issue when it comes to folks that are differently abled. We see a lot of the same patterns from early, very young ages on that discipline track that just spirals when it's, we're not looking out for folks and making sure that doesn't happen. We've also seen, at least in our community, then with adults that are not necessarily getting the care that they need will come in and out of the system dozens of times. Maybe someone that is dealing with schizophrenia has trouble accessing their meds, and they have to make a terrible choice between keeping their job or getting a job, but then as soon as they get a job, they don't get the benefits for the medication that they need, but they can't afford the medication without the job. And so sometimes they go off their meds and then end up in a situation where the law enforcement has to intervene, and they end up going to a court, and then maybe end up getting the help that they need, but that's only for a fixed period of time, and so they end up back out and in a similar situation. They end up off their meds and round and round it goes, and just the incredible tragedy of that, and the systemic burden. And really, there are better ways for our society to be dealing and helping with these types of things. Sometimes mind-boggling.
Yeah, that's true.
The other thing that I wanted to bring up, just when it comes to kind of a different sort of intersectionality, is around interfaith issues. You had mentioned it at one point in our dialogue. This is certainly Anabaptist, but we may have viewers from lots of different faith traditions. And what is the role of our conversations around our interfaith interactions and disability?
Yeah, I just think it's really good for us to work together. So I think, just speaking from a Canadian viewpoint, because that's where I'm from, so I know that in Canada there is always this tendency to be like this one church and sort of like sheep steal, or whatever you want to say, like, oh, we have to be this church with the biggest disability program so that more people come to our church. But for me, I think that's what I say. The number one thing I say when churches started approaching me saying, can you help out with our disability ministry? I said, to me, it's not a competition. It's not about creating the best disability ministry so that everyone will come to your church, because it's actually something I think that every church and every synagogue and every mosque and every temple in Canada should be doing to begin with, right? So I think that there's this tendency sometimes in certain traditions and certain churches where it's like, oh, I'm a Christian, so I can't ask the Muslim community what they're doing, or I can't ask the Jewish community what they're doing. But I think sort of in diversity is our strength. So if you know that there's other people around you, then you can play off their strengths. And actually, that's one of the churches that I'm helping out with their disability ministry at the moment. They are sort of doing that, where they actually have been intentionally advertising, that's probably not the right word, but they have intentionally been promoting their disability ministry in secular places. And someone even found out about the ministry through bringing their children to a hockey lesson and being at an arena. And this is not a church family, but because that church happened to be that family happened to be at an arena, and they have a child with a disability, and they saw this poster, and now they're attending the church. So that's like one way that sort of we're using it as evangelism, or to include more people into their life.
Yeah, that speaks to some of what you were getting at earlier around, being intentional with being a mission field, and potentially an incredibly large, untapped mission field, that shame on the church for not pursuing that more strongly. And so maybe with that in mind, you could touch us a little bit of what might be the practical steps for a church that has maybe been listening to our conversation together and is thinking in their minds, yeah, that makes a lot of sense for us. We'd like to be better about that. What are maybe a handful of ideas for that church to kind of get started?
Yeah, sure. I think, like I mentioned near the beginning, one of the best ways would be just to ask people in your own congregation what their experience of church has been, and don't put up a protective lens. A lot of times people don't want to hear negative feedback, they only want to hear positive, but I think the key is actually being open to hearing the negative feedback, because a lot of people in the the church who have disabilities have been jaded. And we don't actually often think about that, but when I was in Belfast, I met this one woman who has this daughter with Down syndrome, and her daughter has chosen not to go to church as an adult because as a child, no church would ever include her. So now as an adult, she says, there's no point for me to go. And we don't usually think about people with disability making those decisions, but they're just like the rest of us. If they don't have a good experience, they feel that there's no reason to go. So trying to make a place where everyone feels included, trying to think about ways that we can include people. So, for example, one of the churches I grew up in, we had a man who has autism, but he's actually very musical, and that church would allow him different times to do special music, and that was really meaningful to him as well as to everyone else in the congregation. I think also, like, looking at the physical structure of the building, now I think, at least in Canada, that we're trying to become, like, physically, so everyone can come in. I think it's actually becoming a law. So, like, you legally have to make your church building accessible. But if you look at some of these old churches and these kind of old cathedrals, like, if they have a lot of stairs or if they don't have a ramp, then that's the first thing that we have to consider, how to make the space itself workable. Also, because a lot of churches, they'll say that, oh, we're accessible, we're wheelchair accessible, but then you go in and they expect the people who use wheelchairs to be at the back of the sanctuary, and that's actually not a very nice welcoming gesture, because when you're at the back of the sanctuary and you're seated, and then usually people will say, oh, let's all stand to sing, and then what you see for the next 20 minutes is just everyone's back. So you can't even see the words, so just thinking about those kind of things would be a really good start.
Yeah, those are great suggestions. Important to think about. I want to turn it over to you if you have any other things that you'd like to add, comments or things that I haven't addressed to this point. Feel free to angles that we still want to get in at this point.
Sure. I think a really good practical activity, if you want to have some fun tonight, is a few years ago I actually did a conference, and I recommended that if you have never experienced disability yourself, it can be really hard to put yourself into another person's shoes. And it's a lot of times churches, it's not that they're intentionally trying to exclude people, it's just because they themselves haven't experienced it or no one close to them has experienced it, and so it just doesn't cross their radar. So some ideas that I have suggested in the past are, for example, one of them is to put a handful of marbles inside your shoe. And that, I say that as literally being in someone else's shoes, because I actually talked to a person who has quadriplegic limitations and he uses a wheelchair. And he said to me once, if you want to understand what it's like for me, it's like putting a handful of marbles in your shoes. That kind of idea that even if you want to stand up, you can't. Thinking about, for example, someone who is hearing impaired, thinking about what that would be like at a church if you had like a ton of cotton in your ears. I mean, not that you actually have to go to church like that, but I think when you kind of put it into these practical examples, when you think more thoroughly through it, from a practical angle, I think that it really helps you to change how you view the church and how you start seeing people with disabilities.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, we're drawing to the end of our session. Deborah, really enjoyed the conversation with you. This has been MennoNerds webcast. I'm Katelin Hansen, Church for All People in Columbus, Ohio, and by the Strange Fruit blog. I've been speaking with Deborah Ferber, who just does tremendous work around all these ministries with folks that are differently abled. So appreciate you having the conversation with us tonight.
Thanks, Katelin.
Hey everyone, this is Paul Walker. If you like what you just heard, be sure to check out more of what we have to offer at MennoNerds.com. It's the hub for all things MennoNerds. From there you can learn more about these podcasts, syndicated blogs from people all over the world, books authored by some of our members, and a host of other exciting free resources for you and your church. Now there's one last thing. What we do costs a bit of money, And we're always doing it on a volunteer basis. We have people that are committed to making this happen, but we could use more people. If you like what we do, please consider donating monthly. We have two options. You can either do a monthly donation through Patreon, or you can give a one-time donation at any time through PayPal. We love the work we do, but we do need your help to keep it going and to expand into new territory. If you would like to donate, check out MennoNerds.com/donate. Thanks for listening, and as always, have a great day.